I just found something on the government's own website that they probably don't want you to notice. 84% of America's biggest land giveaway was a scam, and I can prove it with their own numbers. This rabbit hole goes darker than you think. Okay, stop. Before you click away, 3 laws in 6 weeks changed everything. Then the evidence mysteriously burned. The timing? Suspicious doesn't even begin to cover it. Watch what happens next. Here's something wild. I'm not pulling this from some sketchy conspiracy forum. This is straight from the National Archives, literally the government's official keeper of American history. And there's one sentence on their Homestead Act page that should make every American stop and ask questions. Between 1862 and 1904, the U.S. government gave away 500 million acres of land. But here's the kicker. Only 80 million acres actually made it to the homesteading families. I'm going to let that sink in for a second. I triple-checked this because it seemed too blatant, so I did the math myself. 420 million acres went somewhere else. That's 84% of the program, not to hard-working farmers and brave pioneers, to speculators, cattle tycoons, mining magnates, lumber barons, and massive railroad corporations. This is on the government's website right now. The Homestead Act is practically sacred in American history class. Abraham Lincoln signs this beauty on May 20th, 1862. The deal sounds incredible. Any citizen can claim 160 acres of public land, work it for 5 years, pay an $18 filing fee, and boom, you're a landowner. The American dream in its purest form. The first person to file? Daniel Freeman at exactly midnight on January 1st, 1863 in Gage County, Nebraska. This guy actually convinced a clerk to open early so he could file before shipping out for military service. It's the kind of all-American story that gives you goosebumps. And on paper, it was revolutionary. Formerly enslaved people could file, immigrants declaring citizenship could file, single women heading households could file. For the first time ever, ordinary people could own land just by working it. No royal bloodline required, no massive fortune needed. The impact was massive. Over 25,000 Black Americans migrated to Kansas alone in the 1870s and 80s. They called it the Exoduster movement, chasing this promise. And today, about 93 million Americans, roughly 1 in 4 people in this country, trace their family's land and wealth back to this one law. So when the government's own records show 84% of the land went somewhere completely different, you have to wonder what really happened. And when you start digging, what you find isn't random fraud, it's a system engineered to fail. The law was designed with loopholes. I'm not speculating. The National Archives literally describes it as framed so ambiguously that it seemed to invite fraud. Check this out. The law said you had to build a 12 by 14 dwelling on your claim. Sounds reasonable, right? Except they never specified feet or inches. Speculators built doll houses, literally, tiny wooden boxes 12 inches by 14 inches, plopped them on a patch of dirt, and legally claimed 160 acres. The General Land Office, the agency supposed to stop this, deliberately underfunded. They couldn't hire enough investigators, and the ones they did hire, the archive's own words, often susceptible to bribery. But wait, there's more. The law let you skip the 5-year requirement entirely. Just pay $1.25 per acre after 6 months. It was called commuting a homestead. Speculators abused this constantly. File, wait 6 months, pay $200, flip the land, rinse and repeat. Historian Paul Wallace Gates spent his entire career documenting this pattern. His conclusion? Instead of creating family farms, the Homestead Act created a fierce competition for land to resell in which influential speculators came out on top. But that fraud? That's just the warm-up. The real question is, where did those 420 million acres actually go? 6 weeks after signing the Homestead Act on May 20th, 1862, Lincoln signs the Pacific Railroad Act on July 1st. The literal next day, July 2nd, he signs the Morley Land Grant Act. 3 laws, 6 weeks, 1 president. Together, they moved more land than most wars. The railroads alone got 175 million acres between 1850 and 1971. That's bigger than Texas. Northern Pacific, 40 million acres. Union Pacific, 19 million. Southern Pacific, 18 million. These weren't loans. These were gifts, free and clear. And then, plot twist, the railroads turned around and sold this free government land to the exact settlers who were supposed to get it free. They opened recruitment offices in Europe, ran ads targeting desperate immigrant families, and sold them land the taxpayers had just given away. The Library of Congress has evidence showing railroad companies created fake maps, making their land look way better than it was. And here's the part that gets me. Today, in many Western states, the biggest private landowners are still the corporate descendants of those railroad companies. The land never came back. The Morley Act, same playbook, different target. Every state got 30,000 acres per congressional representative to fund colleges. Sounds great, right? Except 10.7 million of those acres were ripped directly from over 250 indigenous nations. Cornell University alone got nearly 1 million acres, stolen from 230 different tribes across 15 states. A Pulitzer investigation found that over 500,000 acres are still owned by states for universities today. In 2019 alone, those lands generated $8.6 million, and for more than a quarter of those parcels, the original inhabitants never received a single dollar, not one. 3 laws, 1 summer, 1 president. The Homestead Act gave everyone the feel-good story. The Railroad and Morley Acts gave corporations and institutions the actual land. But none of this works unless you deal with the people already living there. Now, a reasonable person might say land fraud happens, railroads needed incentives, universities needed funding. Fair points. If this was just about corruption and greed, it'd be a boring story. But the Homestead Act didn't give away empty land. It gave away land that had to be emptied first. And the system built to empty it? That's where this gets disturbing. The Dow's Act of 1887. Senator Henry Dow's of Massachusetts. President Grover Cleveland signs it February 8, 1887. On the surface, it claims to help Native Americans through individual land ownership. Each family gets 160 acres, the exact same as the Homestead Act. That's not a coincidence.
Everything left over? Declared surplus and opened to white settlers. In 1887, Native Americans held 138 million acres. By 1934, when this nightmare finally ended, 48 million. 90 million acres, gone. 2/3 of everything. About 90,000 Native Americans, 2/3 of the population, were made landless. Senator Henry Teller of Colorado opposed this in 1881. His words are in the congressional record. The real aim is to get at the Indian lands and open them up to settlement. The provisions for the apparent benefit of the Indians are but the pretext to get at his lands and occupy them. He said this publicly, before the vote, and they passed it anyway. The mechanism was brilliant and brutal. After the 25-year trust period expired, the land became subject to property taxes. Most Native people had no cash income and no experience with this imposed tax system. They couldn't pay. Tax auction. And according to researchers, white buyers were literally lining up waiting for the land to go into foreclosure. The Dawes Act also created checkerboarding, native parcels scattered across different counties, with white settler land filling the gaps. Managing fragmented land became impossible, by design. And the act didn't even give them farming tools. When asked if they'd get seeds and equipment, Dawes himself said, "Whether Congress will be liberal enough to set him up, I don't know." This wasn't a bug, this was the feature. This is how 90 million acres of treaty land became homesteads, railroad grants, and corporate holdings. But you can't just take land, not permanently, unless you also break the connection between people and their land. 1879, Captain Richard Henry Pratt opens the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. His philosophy, stated at a national conference in 1892, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." 7 words. Children as young as 5 were taken from their families, haircut, names replaced, speaking their own language, forbidden with punishment. Between 1819 and 1969, the federal government ran or funded 408 boarding schools across 37 states. A 2022 Interior Department investigation found burial sites at 53 schools, over 500 documented child deaths. The government spent $23.3 billion in today's money on this system. I'll be honest, when I started researching the Homestead Act, I expected land fraud stories. I didn't expect to find a parallel system specifically designed to remove children from the same communities whose land was being seized. But the timeline doesn't lie. Dawes Act breaks up reservations, 1887. Boarding schools expand, 1880s, 90s. Homestead Act delivers seized land to new owners. Same period, same government, same decades, same victims. And then there's Oklahoma. The Cherokee were forced from their eastern homes on the Trail of Tears. About 4,000 died on that march. Survivors were promised their new land as long as grass grows and water runs. By 1893, the government was done waiting. September 16th, 1893. High noon, a rifle cracks. Over 100,000 people stampede forward for 6 million acres of Cherokee land. 42,000 homesteads staked in a single afternoon. The heat was so intense, people collapsed. Men fought over stakes. And Sooners who'd snuck in early already claimed the best land before the gun even fired. The government bought this land from the Cherokee for $1.40 per acre after killing their cattle leases by presidential decree. Decades later, the Indian Claims Commission ruled the sale was under duress and undervalued. They awarded $14.7 million in compensation. The land never came back. This wasn't the first run. 1889, 50,000 people race for 1.9 million acres. 1892, 4.3 million acres of Cheyenne and Arapaho land. Each run used the Homestead Act. Each run used the same formula. Treaty land declared surplus, repackaged as opportunity. And then there's the 1890 census. This was the most detailed census ever done. It tracked everything: immigration, property, military service, disabilities, and it was the first to officially declare the frontier closed. The superintendent wrote that settlements had so fragmented the unsettled area that there could hardly be said to be a frontier line. That declaration changed how America saw itself, and then it burned. January 10th, 1921, fire in the Commerce Department basement. 25% destroyed completely, 50% damaged by water and smoke. Cause? Never determined. Maybe a cigarette, maybe faulty wiring, maybe spontaneous combustion of sawdust. Here's what most people don't know. The 1890 census was the first one without backup copies required at local offices. Previous censuses had redundancy. 1890 didn't. One copy, stored on pine shelves outside the fireproof vault, next to a carpenter shop, full of sawdust. Think about that. The 1880 census, inside the vault. The 1900 census, different building entirely. The 1890, in the most flammable room in the building. The damaged records sat in a warehouse for over a decade. Then, February 20th, 1933, Herbert Hoover lays the cornerstone for the National Archives building. The next day, literally the next day, Congress authorizes destroying all surviving 1890 census records. The building meant to preserve records was dedicated the same week they destroyed the census, documenting the most transformative decade in American land ownership. 99.9% gone. 63 million people erased. If you've tried tracing family before 1900, you've hit this wall. 1880 exists, 1900 exists, 1890, the decade of Dawes, boarding schools, Oklahoma runs, railroad grants, is the one you can't see. Maybe I'm connecting dots that aren't there. Maybe these are unrelated policies by different people across different times. Maybe the homestead fraud was incompetence. Maybe railroad grants were practical. Maybe Dawes meant well. Maybe boarding schools were misguided idealism. Maybe the fire was bad luck. Maybe it's all coincidence. I've thought about that, and I keep coming back to the numbers. 500 million acres, 80 million to families, 175 million to railroads, 10.7 million to universities, 90 million taken through Dawes, 408 boarding schools, 1 destroyed census. Those aren't random facts. That's a balance sheet. So what does this mean for you? 93 million Americans descend from homesteaders. That's real. The farms were real. The work was real. The families were real. But so was the system that enabled it. The law had intentional loopholes. Agencies were deliberately underfunded. People on the land were removed through legal tricks, boarding schools, and broken treaties. Records were destroyed. And 420 million of 500 million acres went to corporations, speculators, and institutions, still holding much of it. I'm not saying homesteaders were villains. They were participants in a system designed to use them as moral cover for something much bigger. The land you stand on has a story. Every deed traces to a transfer. Every transfer traces to a policy. Every policy traces to someone deciding who deserved land and who didn't. The question isn't whether this happened. The government archives prove it. The question is why we were taught the Homestead Act was a gift when the numbers show it was something completely different. And what else from that era were we taught wrong?